Well, good. Thank you for having me again to Kenya. And it's early in the morning for me. It's later in the evening for you. And by God's grace, through technology, we're coming together. And I'm thankful for that. Thank you for the prayer, Sister Ruth. And we ask that God will hear your prayer and will bless us through our study today. We're continuing on in the book of Daniel, and we are going into that book with, I think, great interest. I really love the book of Daniel. I remember first as a Christian, when I started reading the book, I had forgotten there was a book of Daniel that was even in there, and I thought, oh wow, my namesake, I better read this. And so I read it, and ever since 1996, I have been reading this book and trying to understand it better. And so we're going to go through the first portion of this chapter, Daniel 8, and we're going to try to go through slowly to see what's happening and why we can try to understand what it's saying. So if you do have your Bible, you can open it up to Daniel 8, but we're also going to be looking on the screen here and trying to understand what it is that the scripture is saying. So now in Daniel chapter 8, we've already talked about chapter 7 being the kingdoms of different beasts, very similar to Daniel chapter 2. Well, here in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, now this word Belshazzar, it's not the first time we've seen that name. Interestingly, this is the only time that you can see this word specifically in the Bible. Now why? Because we've already read about Belshazzar in the past. Well, the reason why is because Daniel 8 is now starting in on Hebrew again. And the only time Belshazzar is used in the book of Daniel outside of the Hebrew is in Aramaic. Now, so if I went and right-clicked and looked for the word instead of the specific Hebrew number, I would find that there are 8 times that this word has been used. And so Belshazzar starts in chapter 5. Remember, he made a great feast for his lords. And then in chapter 2, the same thing happened. He's tasting the wine. And then in chapter 5, the king Belshazzar was greatly troubled. And, his son, Belshazzar, has not humbled your heart. And it says that then commanded Belshazzar that they would clothe Daniel and with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck. So Belshazzar highly respected Daniel for what Daniel was able to reveal to him and the boldness that he had. Well, this is interesting because Daniel chapter 5, it says, in that night Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And so wait a minute, Belshazzar's dead? Well, yeah, but Daniel chapter 7, we talk about Belshazzar, and Daniel chapter 8, we talk about Belshazzar. So it's just kind of interesting that Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8 are actually before Daniel chapter 5. And so the reason why I bring this up is because the book of Daniel is not written in chronological order. Neither necessarily is the book of Revelation. Both Daniel and Revelation are laid out in such a way that it's more understandable. For example, in Daniel you have the first, it's like 6 chapters, but really 7 because 7 connects with 2. But the first 6 or 7 chapters you have the history of the life of Daniel and the 3 faithful Hebrews that he was captive with in the country of Babylon. But then also what you have is in Daniel chapter 7 or 8, but it's really 7 through the end, which is 12, you have the prophetic section of the book of Daniel. So the first part is like stories, and we kind of feel like sometimes that's for the kids, and we read them for like children's story and those kind of things. But in all honesty, that's where I think the very strong meat is in preparation for the prophetic section. Because remember, in Daniel chapter 1 through 7, we find the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th chapters dealing specifically with the 3 angels' messages of Revelation chapter 14, verses 6 through 12. We've already talked about that several times. But you can see that in the book of Daniel, but you don't see it necessarily in the prophetic section. You see it in the historic section. And the historic section gives us real life applications to how to live through the prophetic section. You see, so the first part of Daniel which is the historic section, is designed to prepare us for the prophetic section. So don't think that the stories of Daniel being in the lion's den and the Hebrews being thrown into the fire are simply designed for the kids. That's not the case. These are end-time specific messages that we need to understand so that we can be prepared for when the fires are turned up 7 times in our lives, and also when we find ourselves cast into a den of lions with what seems like no hope at all. So those sections are highly prophetic, the history. But now we're looking, like we did in chapter 7, at some of the more prophetic sections of the book of Daniel. So Belshazzar, he's in chapter 7 and 8, but those come actually before he dies in chapter 5. So I think it's really quite interesting how you can see that in the book of Daniel. Now, going on to the book of Revelation, you can see that it's also not laid out chronologically. It's laid out in a sense that it actually follows the biblical model of the sanctuary. The book of Revelation does. Let me give you a quick example. In chapter 1, you see Christ with the candlesticks. And then in chapter 5, you see him with his Father in chapter 4. You see him on the table of showbread. And then you also see in chapter 8 the altar of incense. So that's like the holy place, right? Christ goes from the candlesticks to the table of showbread to the altar of incense. And then you can see as we go on through the book of Revelation, in chapter 11, you're going to see him actually go into, or at least see into, the most holy place. So Christ then leaves the most holy place in chapter 15, and that's where you see the Shekinah glory, the glory of God filling the temple. So you can see Christ actually going through the sanctuary in the book of Revelation. You can also see the prophets laying out, or the prophet John, laying out the 7 yearly festivals of the people there in the Israelite Levitical priesthood. There's Passover and Day of Unleavened Bread. There's the wave sheaf, or the, what do you call that? I don't remember what that's called. The first fruits. Then there's Pentecost. Then you see the Feast of Trumpets. You see the Day of Atonement, and then you see the Feast of Tabernacles. In that chronological order, you can see the book of Revelation laid out. And so you also see in the book of Revelation, you've got the 7 churches, 7 seals, and 7 trumpets. That's actually the first half of the book of Revelation, laid out in such a way that you can see history in 3 different ways, but it's not that the churches come first, the seals come second, and then the trumpets come last. It's actually 3 layovers of history, if you will. And so that's what the book of Revelation does. It's similar to the book of Daniel. You've got Daniel laying out history and then prophecy. And so it doesn't necessarily mean it's in chronological order, but it makes better sense the way that Daniel is laid out, similar to the way that Revelation is laid out, or at least not similar, but in a sense kind of the same. So that's why I think it's interesting to look at this name Belshazzar, because you find that he's actually dead by the time this story is laid out, if it's chronological, but it's not. That's why it's before chapter 5. Anyways, we can go and see that here, when we're looking at this word Belshazzar, it's in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. Okay, so now I'm going to go up once and notice that in chapter 7, it says in the 1st year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So, okay, so Daniel talked about his visions of chapter 7, because remember, Daniel had a dream. It was in the 1st year of Belshazzar. But if you go back to where we were talking about in chapter 8, this is the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. A vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel. So now, this is Daniel's 2nd vision during the reign of Belshazzar. Now, it says, after that which appeared unto me at the first. Now, the word after simply means chronological. So this is like after the first one. After the first vision, which appeared unto me at the first what? The first year of the reign of Belshazzar, right? At the first vision, perhaps during the time that Belshazzar was king. Anyways, this first verse actually gives you quite a little bit of history if you're just looking at it more in detail, okay? And then it says, I saw in a vision. Now that word vision is important because it's the same word here. If I triple click this word, it's shazon, okay? Now I'm going to close that, and I'm going to go and triple click this word as well, and this word is shazon. This is shazon. There's another one called mera, and so Daniel goes through this chapter, Daniel chapter 8, with different words for vision. And I tell you that not because we're going to go into the details of that as we go into this chapter. We're going to talk about it, but I'm not going to go into the details of it. That's for you to study for yourself. If you're interested to download the Bible program, either Accordance or eSword or Blue Letter Bible, there's so many of them, but some of them are better than others. I just chose this one because I've been using it for so long, it just makes sense to me. It was actually after eSword was kind of unavailable for the Macintosh. That's what I use this one for. Anyways, if you download this program, Accordance, there's a tutorial online that will help you to learn better how to use it. Not all the tools and tricks you'll learn, but I've been able to create something to show kind of what I have done to be able to help me to know better what the Bible is saying when you're looking up phrases and Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek words. And it really is helpful. It's helpful at just a click of a couple buttons, you'll be able to find a lot of information. So that's kind of why you can easily search for the word Belshazzar and find that it appears 8 times, whereas if you right click and show that one time in Daniel 8, it only occurs once, and you're wondering why. Why is it one time if the word is 8 times used? It's because it's Hebrew instead of Aramaic, right? So some of those things are helpful when you're looking at the original languages. Now, so I saw in a vision, this is the Chalson, and it came to pass when I saw. Now, this is the second time the word saw is used. I saw in a vision, and when I saw, so this is something Daniel was actually seeing. Now, why do I bring this up? It's because when we're looking at the book of Revelation, when we're looking at the book of Daniel, these are visual pictures. It's not just black on white. It's not just words that you need to like understand about what it's saying. These are actual occurrences that Daniel was seeing. So in a vision, in a dream, if you will, Daniel was seeing these things. It's funny because I don't normally have dreams, but I can't forget this dream that I had the other night. I grabbed my wife that was walking by, and it was kind of cold, so she was dressed pretty warmly, but I grabbed her and I started tickling her, and she was laughing a lot, and that was my dream. It was like, what in the world was that about? But it was something that I visually saw. I'm able to recall it, and I could write it out if I wanted to. But I'd have to write it in a couple of different perspectives because it's not just one picture that I can write about as though it happened just like that. There was movement that occurred. And so that's why Daniel is seeing these things. I mean, you can probably pull up a picture that you have, or a movie, if you will, of a dream that you had, and be able to recount in ways that you can't just say it one time. You have to write it from different perspectives. Like you write a little section about that part, and then you start back a little bit and write a little bit about that part, and then you see it from a different perspective. That's what Daniel's doing. That's what John is doing in the book of Revelation. So if you tried to write out a visual happening of your own, whether it be you walking to the store, or you getting out of bed, or perhaps you tripped and fell, whatever it is, if you try to write that out, you can't just write it in one straight sentence. It's got to be from different perspectives. After you hit the ground, when you were looking up, after you fell, while you were falling, what you recalled while you were going down, what you thought about after you were on the ground. You know, all those things you'll have to write about from different perspectives. So if we try to understand what's happening in the fact that these are actual movies that are occurring, then you might be able to see why Daniel and why John, the Revelator, is writing from those different perspectives. I'm explaining because hopefully this will help you in your further study to be able to understand a little bit more of why things are written the way they are in the prophetic books, okay? So I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace. Now, Shushan in the palace, now, I mean, for example, when I said, let me just go back for a second. When I said that I had a dream and it was cold, that's why my wife was dressed warmly, you'll understand that it was probably winter, right? Or sometime where I was in a place that it was cold. Maybe I was in a freezer. I don't know. I mean, you can come up with a whole bunch of stuff. Now, I would have to explain to you why my wife was dressed warmly in my vision, in my dream. Now, it wasn't a vision from God. I'm sure it was just a random thought that I had, but Daniel specifically mentions Shushan. Now, why? Why did he mention Shushan? We're going to try to understand a little bit more as a result of going in and triple clicking that word to see what the Hebrew says about that word. And I think that will be helpful for us to understand a little bit more about this specific prophecy. Notice what we find when we go through and see, I was at Shushan in the palace. Okay, now Shushan, if you triple click that word, it's a place in Persia. Oh, wait a minute. I thought Daniel was in Babylon. No, well, yeah. But remember, Daniel was in Babylon, but he was also in Persia. Because if you remember, I'm going to go to the end of Daniel chapter 6, and then I'm going to scroll up real quick and find that in that night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans or Babylonians, was slain. And who reigned? It was Darius the Median. He was actually under a different king. He was under Cyrus the Persian. And Darius the Median took the kingdom. And that's why we have the Medes and the Persians together, where we're talking about the image of Daniel chapter 2, and the chest and arms were the Medes and the Persians. Well, because Darius here was a Median, and he overtook Belshazzar in Babylon. And so here, the Medians, or later the Persians, took the kingdom, and he was a certain years old, right? So what we find in Daniel chapter 8 is that the Persians have something to do with this vision. And it's quite interesting because what occurred with Daniel is he reigned during the years of King Nebuchadnezzar. And then there was a change in kingdoms, and in fact, Belshazzar actually ended up being more the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, if you will. And so that's why Daniel was talking to him the way he did in Daniel chapter 5, where he talked about your father, but it was really his father's father. It was his grandfather. So Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather, okay? Anyways, when you go through and look at what happens in Daniel chapter 8, and you find that he was in Shushan, that's important. He was in this vision, he was in Persia. He was not in Babylon. But this was during the time that a Babylonian king was ruling. Well, we learn, remember later, Daniel 8 is before Daniel chapter 5, and we learn in chapter 5 that the Medes take over. And the Medes and the Persians are ruling, right? And so in a vision that Daniel has about the future, and he starts out in Persia, we've got to wonder, like, what's happening? Well, I'll tell you what's happening. Daniel chapter 8 is seeing during the time where the Babylonian king, which is Belshazzar, has already been wiped out, and the Medes and the Persians have already taken over. You see, so Daniel is seeing into the future, basically foretelling that Babylon's going to be no more. He is now, in this vision, in Persia. So he's actually taken into the future, if you will, and he's looking around and he's saying, I'm in the palace and I'm in Shushan. And so Daniel is seeing that he's in a place that's not Babylonian. Why is that important? Because the Persians are going to take over, right? So when you're looking here at this vision, and it says, it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. So Shushan has provinces. One of the provinces is Elam. Now, Elam is not a word that it really tells you about in the Hebrew here, where it tells you about the province or the information that gives you where it is. It actually just tells you that he's a son of Shem, right? Is that what it was? Let me triple click again. Yeah, he was a son of Shem, right? That's right. So that's what it's saying there, but you can see that Shushan is Persian, and it's in the province of Elam, so you can gather that Elam is Persian as well. And I saw in a vision, and that word vision again is the same one, Shauson. It's, I saw in a vision, I was by the river of Ulai. It's actually, I'll show you a trick here. It's this word I said you lie because I've said that for so many years, but this is actually the way to pronounce it. If you triple click and you look at it, it's ulai, ulai. And this little thing right here, this, what do you call that? The apostrophe, I guess it is. It's the accent. It tells you where to use the accent in your voice. So it's ulai. It's ulai, not ulai. Okay, ulai. So that's how to say that. Okay, so ulai is, or ulai is, right here it says Persian derivation. So the place that he was, this river, it's a river of Persia. Now, why that's important again is because Shushan is Persian, ulai is Persian, and we need to understand that Daniel is seeing a vision in Persia. That's where he's starting. And that's really important because he said, during the reign of Belshazzar, I'm having a vision, but the vision is about being in Persia. I lifted up my eyes and I saw, and behold, there stood before me, before the river rather, a ram which had 2 horns. Now okay, let's understand a little bit better. He saw, again, this is a visual thing, and behold, you need to see as well. That's what that phrase means. I saw, and you need to see. Behold, there stood. He didn't move, he was standing. So this animal, it's a ram, he was standing there. And he was standing before the river. What river? He just talked about the river. It's the Ulai, or Ulawi. How do you say that? Ulai. And so, or it's Ulai. He's standing before the river, and it's a ram that had 2 horns. Now, you'll notice that this phrase here, 2, is italicized. The reason why it's italicized is it's not a word that is in the original language. What happened is the translators decided that they would put that word in so that the reader would be able to understand better what's happening. Now, how do they know it's 2? Why isn't it 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, or 157? Well, the reason why is because in the Hebrew, as it is in the Greek, if you have a phrase that is plural, it is not 3. It is not 1. It is 2. Okay, so that's why they know that it's 2 horns. Because if I were to say there are blankets in the Hebrew, in America, and I'm not sure about in Kenya, but in America, the person asking would say, well, how many blankets? Because our language doesn't denote 2 if I use the word plural. It could potentially be any number of blankets. I could be talking about a mountain of blankets, or I could be talking about 2. Anything in between 2 and a million or more is what it means in English when I say blankets. But here in the Hebrew, if you say something plural, like horns, you automatically know it's 2. Now, if you wanted to talk about more horns, you would say, there are 3 horns. Then you know there's 3 of them. If you said 4, you'd know there's 4. Sorry, I did 3 instead of 4. If you said that there was 8, you'd say that there was 8 horns. But if you just said there were horns, you know automatically that there's 2 because there's no precursor of the amount of horns. Okay, so when you see a plural word in the Bible that doesn't have a precursor of how many that is, it's 2. So people that actually use the word Elohim and say that it's 3 are breaking Hebrew rules. They're actually not doing what's right. Okay, they're just using their own understanding to apply to the idea that the word Elohim means 3. It doesn't mean 3. It means 2 at the most. So what we're seeing here in this section is a word that is italicized, meaning it's not there, it's just put in by the translators to help the person who's reading understand what's happening. And it's true, there were only 2 horns because the word is plural and there's no precursor number that helps us to understand how many horns there were. So when it says there was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one higher than the other. And the higher came up last. So there were two horns, but one was higher than the other. So I'm just going to illustrate for you here. There's a ram standing next to the river that he saw, which was in Persia, and this ram had two horns, but one was higher than the other. Okay? So that's what's happening. We're seeing one is greater or higher than the other. And it's interesting because, I'm not even going to go there, so let's just continue on. And it says in verse 8, I saw the ram pushing. Okay, but the ram, remember, was standing. So the ram stood, but he was pushing. Okay, so what does this word pushing mean? I saw, so he was watching, I saw the ram pushing westward. This word pushing, it actually means to gore, to push, or to push down. Now, he's not moving anywhere necessarily, he's just simply goring. He's using his head, thrashing, or how would you say, thrashing his head to the west. He's thrashing his head northward or southward. He's not going anywhere, but he is using his horns. And one is higher than the other. So that no beast, remember we talked about what beasts are already. We talked about beasts in Daniel 7:17. I'm going to bring that up. Daniel 7:17. It says, these great beasts, which are four kings, which shall arise out of the earth. Now remember in verse 23 though, it says that the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom. It's not just king, like it says there, it's kingdom. And so though it says in verse 17 that the four beasts are four kings, it later clarifies that the fourth beast is the fourth kingdom. Because a king always has a kingdom, and a kingdom always has a king. If you don't have one or the other, you don't have either of them at all. And so here, this ram, which is a beast, it's an animal, it's a kingdom, it's pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no other kingdoms might be able to stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. Now his hand, a ram doesn't have a hand. What is this? What are we talking about? If you triple click this, a hand, it actually is an open hand, not a closed one, and it indicates power, means, or direction. No animal, no kingdom was able to be delivered out of his authority, out of his power, in distinction from the closed hand. So this is what that word actually means, and you can see how it's been translated all these many times. But the original word can denote, as it says here, indicating power, means, or direction. So this hand here, like this ram using his horns to gore to the west, to the north, and to the south, so that no other kingdoms could stand, not move, but stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his power, his authority, his rulership. But he did according to his will and became great. Now I'm going to underscore that one. By the way, this section, his will, that comes up a few times in the book of Daniel. And you'll see a couple times in the book of Daniel chapter 11, it comes up. And that's just an interesting section there to know what's happening with these kingdoms that are coming up, and they're doing according to their own will. We won't get into that till later. But he became great. Now, I actually highlighted that word there because I want to come back to that one in just a moment. Now, becoming great is a big deal, but there's more to it as we continue on. So, as I was considering, so he was still beholding, he was still looking. Behold, that means you need to look as well. A he-goat came from the west. So, from the west. And then he touched not the ground, so he was moving so fast, because this one wasn't standing. No, he wasn't standing. He came. He wasn't standing, he was coming. From the west, traveling east, on the face of the whole earth, and he didn't even touch the ground, he was moving so fast. And the goat, so this he-goat that was referred to, had a notable horn between his eyes. So he's a kingdom already, And this kingdom, as we learned about in Daniel chapter 7, verse 17 and 23, which is a kingdom, an animal or a beast is a kingdom, he had a notable horn between his eyes. Well, wait a minute. We learned about horns, didn't we? In Daniel chapter 7, verse 24. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings. Oh, so the horns are kings. Okay, so there is a beast, which is a kingdom. A beast is a kingdom, and a horn is a king within that kingdom. Okay, so I hope you're understanding what's happening in Daniel chapter 8. There's this beast, which is a goat, and he comes from the various places on the face of the whole earth. And he touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn. So this kingdom had a notable king between his eyes. You see how that's going? And he came to the ram which was standing, which had 2 horns, 2 kings, 2 kingdoms, because a king has a kingdom. And there's, in this kingdom, there's a king with a kingdom. And he had there was this ram, he came to, so he wasn't standing still, he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river. Now that river is there mentioned again. Why that river? That river is Persian, right? So this ram, which I had seen standing, not moving, but standing before the river, which was specifically Persian. And this ram, this beast, he ran, so was moving, ran, not even touching the ground, ran unto him, this first one with 2 horns, in the fury of his power. So this ram was completely beaten down by this goat. Okay? The goat had a notable horn, and he came so fast he wasn't even touching the ground, and he came to the ram and slammed into him, ran unto him in the fury of his power. So visually, if you wanted to see what's happening, there's this goat that's standing there. He has 2 horns, one is higher than the other, and this ram comes through, not even touching the ground, and slams into him. And you're wondering, like, okay, what's going on? Well, there's a kingdom. It's the Medes and the Persians. Why do I say that? Because the Bible actually says it, right? So it's the Medes and the Persians. I'll show it to you in a second. It's the Medes and the Persians. One is higher than the other. The Medes came up first, but the Persians came up last. And the Persians were actually greater than the Medes. So one horn was greater than the other. And what happens is the ram is standing there, and this he-goat, another nation, with a notable king between his eyes. He comes and he slams him, just like wipes him out, completely wipes him out, quickly and furiously. Now that's what's happening in this visual story here, this prophecy. Daniel is seeing that this Medo-Persian power is going to be completely wiped out by this kingdom with a notable king between its eyes. And we're reading this and understanding, wow, this is really intense. Well, how do we know it's the Medes and the Persians, and who is this he-goat that slams? Well, I'm going to show you right now in the book of Daniel. We're going to go to verse 20, and it says, this is now the interpretation, because behold, I will make you to know what shall be in the last of the indignation, the last end of it. For at the appointed time the end shall be. And then he explains the vision. This is Gabriel explaining to Daniel. The ram which you saw, having horns, which are 2 of them, are the kings of Media and Persia. So I'm not making it up when I say the ram is representing Media and Persia, okay? So there we're seeing the ram, the kingdom has 2 kings. Those kings are from Media and Persia. And then it says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 21, and the rough goat, the one that came and slammed the ram, he is the king of Grecia. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now, the greatest king, right? That word first, the first time or rank, the first in place, the greatest king, which is the notable horn that was before or between his eyes, okay? So there we go. The ram represents Medo-Persia, generally, and the rough goat represents Greece. Okay, so now when I go back to Daniel chapter 8 verse 6 rather, and when it says he came to the ram that had two horns, so now let's try to understand it. Greece came to Medo-Persia, that was made up of the Medes and the Persians, had the kings, the Medes and the Persians, which I had seen standing before that Persian river. And he ran unto, or he, this is the Grecian ran unto the Persian, the Medes and the Persians, in the fury of the Grecian power. Oh, you're wondering, like, that makes a lot of sense. So now all of a sudden we're seeing history being described before it happened in beast-type figures. And then it says, and this is kind of an interesting verse, I'm going to read it and then we're going to try to understand it. I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. So this is like, whoa, what are we talking about? The goat and the ram, the goat and the ram, the goat and the ram. Let's try to understand it. And I saw him. Who's him? Greece. I saw Greece come close unto Medo-Persia. And he, Greece, was moved with really great anger. Whoops, sorry, I triple clicked that. Really great anger against Medo-Persia. And he smote Medo-Persia, and brake the two horns that Medo-Persia had. And there was no power in Medo-Persia to stand before Greece. But Greece cast Medo-Persia down to the ground. What ground? Well, remember, he was standing there, not moving. He was standing there in Shushan, and actually next to Ulai, which is the Persian river. So he cast him down in Persia. And he stamped, or the Greece stamped upon Medo-Persia. And there was nobody that could deliver Medo-Persia out of Greece's hand. Do you see how that works? If you're careful with this verse, you can see how it's describing that Greece came and completely destroyed Medo-Persia. And you know that we're talking about Greece and Medo-Persia because it said it. It said it in verses 20 and 21. The ram which had two horns is the kings of Medo and Persia. And the rough goat, he is the king of Grecia, right? The first king. And so now who was this first king of Grecia? Well, he was Alexander the Great. You've probably heard about him. Well, you go back in history and you can learn that Alexander the Great really had a powerful influence over the world, where he was going and destroying, completely wiping out people that were just totally unexpecting that these warriors would come. And why did that happen? Well, because he was kind of ruthless. He didn't care about his army, his soldiers, or about others. Like if there was a call for war, instead of waiting a day or two to travel, he would just travel all night long and would show up in the early morning and completely wipe them out without anybody knowing what was happening, because, man, we thought they were like a day and a half or 2 days away. Well, yeah, but they marched all night and they showed up in the morning and completely destroyed everything. And so those soldiers would go without sleep, they would go without food, they would sometimes just go without anything, and they were just driven by this force to destroy. And that's why this great horn is notable, as it says in the Bible. And he completely wiped out the Medo-Persians. They were just standing there eating by the river, right? They were just enjoying themselves, and this goat comes without even touching the ground and just wipes them out. So anyways, that's what's being described here in the book of Daniel. And so you go now and see that in verse 8, therefore, the he-goat, which is Greece, he waxed, what does it say? Very great. So wait a minute. We saw in verse 4 that the goat, or the ram rather, this ram which was Medo-Persia, he became great. But this he-goat, as he destroyed the ram, he became very great. And we're not even done with that yet, because there's somebody else that shows up on the scene that becomes exceeding great. And so it's like, you know, it's interesting because this is old history, and it's dealing with nations that were great, that became very great, and then became exceeding great. I did a series through the book of Revelation, verse by verse, except through the churches. And you can see in the prophecies of the trumpets, starting in Revelation chapter 8, that there's like the stars, and then the moon, and then the sun, and then this overwhelming, I don't remember what comes up later, but there's these little tiny things that get bigger and bigger and bigger. And not like a star is little tiny, but you can see stars with your eyes that they're really small. And then a moon is quite a bit bigger, and then the sun is way bigger. And then you can see, I don't remember the next thing that it's talked about in the trumpets there, but as I was going through, I was noticing there was like a pattern of things getting from small, or at least big enough to see, bigger and bigger and bigger. And here in the same way in Daniel chapter 8, there's the ram that is great, the he-goat that is very great, and then there's this little tiny horn comes up and it becomes exceeding great. And so it's the same kind of progression in Daniel that you see also in the book of Revelation. I just thought that was really interesting as I've been studying over the years. Therefore, the he-goat, he waxed very great, and when he was strong, not after he was strong, not before he was strong, when he was strong, the great horn that was between his eyes, you know, that first king, as it says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 21, that first king, the great horn that was between his eyes, when he was strong, the great horn was broken. So who is that first king that was really strong? It was Alexander the Great. And that great horn, Alexander the Great, the leader of the Grecians, he was broken when the goat was strong, when he was very great. And so, and what do you find with the history of Alexander the Great? Well, he died in his early 30s. He was doing really well in his, how would you say, conquering of nations. He completely wiped out the Medo-Persians, and he was ruling the then known world at the time. And at that time, at 33 years old, or 32, somewhere around there, because people say different things, the great horn was broken. And in its place, or for that great horn that was broken, there came up four notable ones. Four notable what? Four notable horns. Because this great horn was broken, and there was four notable horns that came up toward the four winds of heaven. Now, what are the four winds of heaven? You have the north, east, west, and south. You can already see that the ram was goring toward the west, toward the north, and toward the south. And you could see that those horns were broken when that great horn on the he-goat came and slammed that ram that was standing in the Persian, or near the Persian river. And then you can see here also that it's talking about that this great horn that was, when it was strong, it was broken. Just like Alexander the Great, when he was doing really well, was broken. He died. Unfortunately, he died. I wish he was given actually the opportunities to learn about the gospel. He wanted to learn about the gospel. In fact, he was interested in it when he was kind of like captive and being restored in the camp of the Israelites for a time. And then later he was unwilling to learn, and then later took up the gods of the lands, etc. And he died as an idolater, unfortunately. But so what you have is the Grecian king, he was wiped out as a horn, but there were four notable ones that came up after him. These four notable horns were actually scattered in different directions, toward the north, toward the west, toward the east, and toward the south. And so we can see that these notable horns that came up were part of this story of not another nation, not another beast, but this one horn on this he-goat, which was Grecian. It was broken, and then four horns came up in its place. So it's not another nation necessarily, it's just four kings that came up after that notable one had been broken. So the notable one in Greece was broken, and then four Grecian kings came up. Okay, that's what I think is being said here, and I think it bears to consider that there was the he-goat when he waxed very great. When he was strong, the horn was broken, and in its place came up four notable horns or ones toward the four winds of heaven, toward the east, south, north, and west. And out of one of them, out of one of the horns, or winds, out of one of the winds came forth a little horn. Now, that would have, of course, mandate that because the notable horns went toward the four winds, out of one of these horns toward the four winds came out a little horn. So again, you have what's being described, this great horn on the Grecian nation. It's broken, there comes up four horns out of its place, and then out of one of those horns, there comes up a notable little horn, okay? It was actually, to my recollection, toward the south. And toward the south, ruling over Egypt, there was this little horn that came up, and we're going to read about this in a second. And out of one of them, out of one of the four winds, which had the four horns in the winds in the different directions, out of one of them came forth a little horn. That little horn waxed exceeding great. Okay, so now this one, this little horn, starting off little, as it says here, little, it waxed exceeding great. Now remember, we saw in verse 4 that the ram became great. Later in verse 8, we see that the he-goat waxed very great. And then there's this little horn that waxed exceeding great. You see how that works? It's like 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. I mean, it just keeps on getting bigger, or meter, 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, depending on how you're doing it over there. So out of one of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceeding great. Now this little horn, it's a king or a kingdom. And out of this, one of these winds, one of these four kingdoms, came up this little kingdom. And this little kingdom, it ruled very powerfully. In fact, it became exceeding great. And it went toward the south, kind of like the ram did with its horns, goring toward the south, toward the north, and toward the west. This little horn, it became great, exceeding great, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant. Now the pleasant, what is this pleasant? It's the beautiful, or glorious, or goodly, or pleasant land. Generally referring to the pleasant land, because we know that we're referring to land when we're referring toward the south, toward the east, and toward the goodly or pleasant. This would be, of course, to any Israelite. You can ask Daniel, as he's praying in chapter 9, you can ask him what the pleasant land is, and of course that's the land of Israel. That would be toward the south, toward the east, and I believe at this point toward the north, which would be the pleasant land. And so here, what you're seeing is Daniel is actually looking at this experience of this little horn that comes out of one of the winds, which has a horn in it, and that little horn becomes exceeding great. And he's also pushing around trying to gather ground, right? Just as all the kingdoms had done and all the kings that had been doing that before him. Well, what's interesting about this little horn that becomes exceeding great, now I'm going to refer to him as the exceeding great horn. As this exceeding great horn starts pushing around, you can see just as he did it like the ram that we talked about before, which was Medo-Persia. He was goring toward the different directions of the land that was around him. And this one, at first, he goes toward the land that's around him almost like a lateral attack, right? He's going toward the east, toward the west, I think it said, and no, toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land, right? So what we have is going laterally. Well, he actually changes focus. And this exceeding great horn, instead of going laterally, he actually goes vertically. Watch, I'll show you now what I mean. So it says, it waxed great, after it waxed exceeding great, it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, which is not necessarily toward the south, toward the east, or toward the pleasant land, but now we're going vertically to heaven. And it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground, and it stamped upon them, right? So now who is this and what's going on? Well, this, remember, if you're following along with what was going on in Daniel chapter 7, or Daniel chapter 2 rather, you have the four metals. You have Babylon being the head of gold. You have Medo-Persia being the chest and arms of silver. You have Greece being the body and thighs of brass. And then you have Rome. And remember, Rome mixed with miry clay after the divisions, because there was divisions there, and then there was a mixing of miry clay. Anyways, we have the church combining together with the apostate or pagan nation, right? So we have a church and state unity there in the feet and legs of that statue. Well, you go over to what happens with Daniel chapter 7, and you have 4 beasts. The first one being the lion representing Babylon, and then Medo-Persia being that leopard with wings. Oh, sorry, the bear, Medo-Persia, lifted up on one side, kind of like the horns, one is higher than the other. Then you have the leopard with the 4 heads and the wings representing Greece, because he was really fast, kind of like it says here, he wasn't even touching the ground. That's why it says that he had 4 wings in the previous vision, where it says that he is not even touching the ground. It's because it's referring to the same power, the Medo-Persian power, right? And then the 4th one is that dreadful beast that we couldn't figure out what it was, but we brought some connections together with what was happening over there in Revelation chapter 13, and we can see that that power was very similar to the one that is in Daniel chapter 7. And so the chapter 7 of Daniel, that terrible beast, and Revelation 13, that beast that's hard to describe because he looks like a leopard, he looks like a bear, and looks like a lion, but he's got 7 heads and all that. Well, you put those things together and you realize it's the same power. It's Rome. So John was in Rome looking backwards, whereas Daniel is in Babylon, and in this vision, he's in Medo-Persia looking forward, right? So when you put these together, you realize, what was that little horn that it became exceeding great? Well, it was the next power. It was the next system that came into being. It was Rome. You have the ram, which was Medo-Persia. You have the he-goat being Greece. And the next power that comes in was Rome. But Rome had 2 phases, you see. Rome was first pagan. It was civil in its entirety, but unfortunately it was even religious in its pagan experience. Because, like, for example, if you go back and you learn about Rome, you learn that the Caesars demanded worship. And there were a lot of people that were killed if they did not give to the Caesars the worship that they demanded, and the lordship and the servitude. For example, a Caesar was your Lord and your God. And if you didn't call him your Lord and your God, if you didn't kiss his ring, if you didn't offer up incense, if you didn't pray to him, bow to him as he's going by, if you didn't give him your taxes, kind of like your tithe-ish, you know, if you just want to put the 2 together, then you were a heretic, you were somebody that needed to die, and you could be slain on the spot, beheaded, tortured, crucified, all of those things. And that was in Rome. And so Rome was very much religious, although it becomes ultra-religious and different type of religious later in its experience, which we know was a change in its experience. There was a shift in its focus. So going back to what we're seeing in this little horn that became exceeding great, that's the Roman power, okay? I'm just going to say it to you, because that's what follows on with Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and the same thing's going on here, especially when you connect it with Revelation chapter 13. You see that it's all fitting together. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Right now we're talking about this exceeding great horn, which was Rome. Now Rome, it had 2 phases. It was first pagan, which, like I said, there was the Lord and God, which was the Caesar, and if you didn't bow to him, you could be slain on the spot. They were very serious with their worship and their how would you say, the servitude, the submission to the Lord and God on the earth, which was the Caesar. Now, this exceeding great horn, first he went laterally, but then you can see a shift in his focus. He went vertically, even unto the host of heaven. That's the change. That's where you see this very major change in the focus of this exceeding great horn. He was first pagan, and then he became religious. And that's what's extremely important about this section here, is that it goes on to say, out of one of them came forth a little horn which was exceeding great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. And this is all earthward, okay? And it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host to the end of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Basically what's happening is it's destroying, just like what it's been told about in the iron legs and that beast-like power of Daniel chapter 2 and 7. He's doing the exact same things. He's destroying, and this, in verse 10 and onward, is where we're going to come together next time, and we're going to try to understand what God has been saying in the history of these nations, showing us just what has occurred in the goat, or the ram, the goat, and these horns that come up that become exceeding great and start ruling over the world in a way that is very negative, very, very destructive. And so what we're seeing is that God loves his people so much that he's revealing the future to them through his prophet Daniel. And we now, on this side of those prophecies, can look back and say, wow, that's just what happened in all these prophecies. And we can see that if God can handle the experiences of the world like he did then and was able to foretell them, could he not take care of my life and be able to guide me as he guided nations in the past? And of course the answer is yes, an absolute yes. God is able and willing to guide my life as he guided nations in the past. And so I want to pray together with you all, asking that God would guide my life, would guide your life, and we'd be able to continue to endure as Christians, even in the world that is completely contrary to him, like when the exceeding great horn ruled. We can still have the faith and the power to live those lives on this earth that God would have us to through the Spirit of his Son. So let's pray and ask God to continue to lead and guide our lives as we surrender to him. Father in heaven, we're asking that you would bless us as we seek to understand what it is that your Spirit is saying to the churches. We thank you that the imagery in Daniel chapter 8 is not only illustrating what you have done in history, but I had forgotten to mention that even the goat and the ram, when they're used together, they're illustrating a certain service of yours, which is the Day of Atonement in the Old Testament services of the Levitical priesthood. I pray that you'd help us to understand a little bit more about what's going on with these nations and these animals that you chose to use, so that as we study further in the future, we'll be able to understand why you've chosen these things and why you've illustrated these animals and the kingdoms and the nations. What is the purpose? And we can learn so much from them and how you love and care for us. Because you've been able to do that with nations, we believe you can do that with our lives, and we surrender our lives to you, asking for your continued mercy as we continue to serve you. And we thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.